Tim is a professor, and is recorded, just so you know. He's a professor in history and philosophy of science at Cambridge. Amongst the many things he's worked on is the standard evolutionary synthesis, but he also had a ERC-funded project, I think, on a science of human nature, and that's what he's going to talk about today. And he's basically going to take the lead from John's process thinking to make a skeptical case about the very idea of human nature. So,
thank you very much. I've rarely been so pleased to be invited to a meeting. It's an absolute joy to be here. John has been a very kind of reassuring and inspiring presence throughout my career. I think probably the first time one of the first times I remember meeting you, John, was at a reading group that Catherine Hawley organised on the disorder of things, and you came to Cambridge and spoke to a group of us, probably back in about 99, 2000, something like that. John was the most wonderful philosophical interlocutor on that occasion, and always has been ever since. When I started my PhD back in 1998, the UK was a fairly lonely place for philosophers of biology. There wasn't that much going on, so it was inspiring to have John here. He fairly recently moved over from Stanford. It was also reassuring when I found out that John and I actually shared the same PhD supervisor. So Nick Jardine supervised both of us, and it was useful to discuss various aspects of Nick's style with John. It was also comforting to me to see John's interest not just in philosophy of biology, but in a politically engaged approach to biomedical ethics. Not always present in John's single-author publications, but he'd done a lot of work with the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, which I admire greatly. I also found, because John and I have a lot in common, I also found out we both claim Huguenot ancestry as well. Anyway, so this is a photo I took out the back of King's College. No bicycles, dogs, or picnics allowed. So, as a metaphysician, you might look at that and think, that's a rather motley assortment. And you might think, well, picnics, that's the odd one out, right? Because that's the temporally extended process. But of course, John says, no. John says that's not the odd one out. And I think, depending on exactly which version of Dupré you read, I think either none of them is the odd one out, or all of them are. They're just processes that go on at different rates and with different forms of stabilization. And the question I always ask whenever John gives a talk on processes is, well, if everything's a process, then who cares, right? You want a notion that differentiates, because otherwise it's not clear what work this generic claim about processes does. And in what's left of my time today, I'm going to try to show that there is payoff when it comes to thinking about human nature. Human nature has been a constant theme in John's work, going all the way back to, I think there's a typo there, although it's probably too small for you to see it. But I think actually that top paper is actually from the 80s. John's done work over the last at least, 30 years or so, focusing on human nature. If I was really flattering, I'd say that I reread all of these pieces of John's. I actually just read all of these pieces of John's quite recently. Some of them I hadn't read before, and they're very instructive. Some themes emerge from John's own work on human nature. Here are the things that crop up repeatedly throughout this oeuvre. What you don't get from John is a sort of philosophical analysis of the form X is a part of human nature, if and only if Y. You do get a willingness to characterize human nature in a fairly loose way as the set of fundamental truths about humans. Certainly a willingness, especially in some of those earlier works, to cast doubt, if I can put it as mildly as that, on some particular accounts of human nature, especially those deriving from evolutionary psychology. I think there's a move in John's work from a pro-culture view to one that instead problematizes the very idea of a division between culture and biology. So back in 1987, John is saying things like the major forces that have an impact on humans are cultural rather than biological. little bit more recently, cultural and biological evolution are intricately and inseparably intertwined. Very consistent processual focus. Even before process was front and center in John's own published work, he would talk about processes. What humans are like is a matter of the constant interaction in human development between internal and narrow biological factors and external social, generally social factors. What I'm calling here an awkwardness on the question of eliminativism about human nature. So these are the kinds of things that John says. 2015, my sympathies lie more with the deniers of human nature than its defenders, but I prefer to say not that there is no human nature, but that human nature is uniquely plastic. 2018, there is much to be said for a flat-out denial that there is any thing as human nature. I think it's safer to dispense with its use altogether. So somewhat slippery on this question about eliminativism, but also just a general suspicion of what work this notion does. So most recently in his Gifford lectures, John says it's a generally unhelpful concept. So I've just told you what John says. I haven't told you whether I agree with any of this. So let's put this all in amber at the moment. And we'll see, in the manner of some grotesque philosophical game show, whether these things are going to turn red or green by the end of the talk. Of course, as many of you know, the traditional way that philosophers show their respect for somebody at occasions like this is by completely trashing their work. Spoiler, I'm not going to do that. So a well-known starting point for philosophical discussion of human nature in the last few decades is David Hull's paper from 1986, where he argued very strongly against the notion of human nature, but specifically against what you might call a taxonomic conception of human nature. I won't read out the quotation, you can look at it yourselves. What Hull was particularly railing against here was the idea that biology might endorse a notion of human nature that would somehow serve as an essence of the species, that would somehow give us some set of traits which all and only members of Homo sapiens would possess. Hull argued that biological taxonomy didn't work that way, specifically didn't work by trying to pick out intrinsic properties of individuals as definitive of species membership. And instead, what made individuals members of the same species was always a matter of the relations that they enter into. And Michael Gieslin also endorsed this kind of skepticism of the very idea of human nature, arguing that human nature, if you're a biologist, should be written off as a mere superstition. Now, since then, I think a lot of people have thought that this goes too far, or at least merely being skeptical of this taxonomic notion of human nature shouldn't mean that you're skeptical of all ways of conceiving of human nature. So obviously, there is a long tradition within philosophy of writing things like treatises on human nature. Should we dismiss the very project that Hume sets himself here simply because of some claims that the likes of Gieslin and Hull make about how taxonomy works? In particular, and this is the point that, so a lot of what I say for John actually goes for some work that Paul Griffiths has done as well. Paul says quite similar things to John in a lot of his papers, but today's about John, so I won't talk about him. Specifically, the simple idea that there might be some important general truths about what humans are like seems to be immune to the worry that there may be no taxonomic essence that will define individuals as humans. And so Hume kicks off his treatise claiming that all the sciences have a relation, greater or lesser, to human nature, roughly speaking, because all of the sciences need to know what people are like, even maths and philosophy. And the way that Hume thinks about this notion of human nature is partly generated by comparing what humans are like with what animals are like. Not because humans necessarily have to be different from animals, part of what we might learn sometimes about human nature, Hume says, it consists in the ways in which we actually realise that we're similar to animals in various respects. So you might think that you can fall back on a kind of minimal notion of human nature, what one might call Humean nature, simply as that set of general truths about what humans are like, without taking those necessarily to be definitive of what it is to be an instance of Homo sapiens as opposed to some other species. But even this simple notion of Humean nature is, I think, problematic in various respects. There have been lots of proposals over the past few years to try to kind of flesh out this more Humean approach that might survive the Giesling whole criticism. I think when you look at the specifics of those proposals, I think some are too permissive, others aren't permissive enough. And I think John's approach, not just the more recent work on process, but some of his earlier work on human nature, helps to show why human nature remains a problematic notion, even in this much milder Humean formulation. And I'm going to have a couple of stalking horses here. One of those is recent work by Grant Ramsey, which I'm going to try and suggest is too permissive, and also some work by Edouard Machery, which I'm going to suggest is not permissive enough. And then hopefully John will win the day. Okay. So Grant Ramsey has defended in several publications recently something that he calls the life history trait cluster count. He motivates this in a very plausible way. So at one point, he draws an analogy with a baseball. The nature of a baseball lies in how it performs in various circumstances. So there are various important truths we can say about how a baseball will respond under various conditions. When hit with a bat with a particular angle and velocity, how much is it deformed and how far it will travel. Baseballs don't act outside of their nature, but this doesn't mean that they don't have a nature. Although they have an overall permissive nature, baseballs act in very specific, reliable ways given their particular environmental inputs. So there's a pattern of behavior that's characteristic of baseballs. And, says Grant, there's a pattern of behavior that's characteristic of humans, and that pattern just is human nature. Human nature is the pattern of trait clusters within the totality of extant human possible life histories. I think this proposal sounds really good on the face of it, but I think when you burrow a little bit further into some of the things Grant says, problems emerge. So here's what you might think Grant Ramsey is doing. You might think he's saying something like this. Take a specific baseball, its nature just consists in what it's like, its reliable dispositions, and those reliable dispositions can be described using a set of input-output conditionals. Similarly, human nature just consists in what humans are generally robustly like. Human nature picks out widely shared human dispositions, even though some of them may not be actualized at various circumstances, and we can express those dispositions using conditionals as well, hence trait clusters, where that's simply the set of input-output conditionals that you might want to endorse that picking up human dispositions. And a lot of what Grant says implies this kind of view. This is his very recent element. I know from CUP copy editors, and some of you will have written these things, that you're not allowed to call a Cambridge element a book. It's an element. They're very specific about this. Nor are you allowed to call the chapters in an element chapters. They have to be called sections. Sections. Socrates' death is explained by his consumption of hemlock. It is our nature to die from its consumption. So you might think he's just spelling out these dispositions that we all share, including things like, if anybody consumes hemlock, they'll die. But it's not actually how Grant spells his account out, because he includes all patterns within the scope of human nature with no constraints whatsoever. So anything that can be expressed using any conditional you like relating to humans turns out to be part of the pattern of human nature in Grant's view. So if some humans consume lactose, they become sick, but others don't. If some humans run as fast as they can, they cover 100 meters in less than 10 seconds, but others don't. If some humans indulge their favorite weekend activity, and I know this because I've got a 13-year-old son, they dedicate it to memorizing pi to an arbitrarily large number of digits. So one of the problems for granting is it turns out to be maximally permissive. There's really nothing that's excluded. And so that means that it's hard to understand the urgency of trying to investigate human nature in this view. You get a very different view from Edouard Machery. Edouard says in an analysis that he's defended repeatedly over many years, human nature is the set of properties that humans tend to possess as a result of the evolution of their species. So this approach really is meant to keep some things in and rule other things out. Not all truths about humans are supposed to be included within the scope of human nature. Human nature picks out a specific set of human traits. They're the ones that most humans have, but they're not just the ones that most humans have, because that might include being able to recognize the face of David Beckham, for example. They're the ones that most humans have as a result of the evolution of their species. Now, there's lots that you might say to complain about this approach. One of them is, what do we mean by saying a result of the evolution of their species? Which processes are the evolutionary processes? And this is something that John's been very keen to problematize, particularly by suggesting that we should be just as willing, because of the transformations that these processes make, and also because of the ways in which they maintain how we are, to endorse forms of cultural evolution, as we are forms of biological evolution. So which of the evolutionary processes, what Edouard says is, saying that a given property belongs to human nature is to reject any explanation to the effect that its occurrence is exclusively due to enculturation and social learning, raises a problem about whether you'll find any traits whose occurrence is really exclusively due to those things. More recently, he's tried to say, in response to criticism, that it's only those traits that are appropriate subjects of ultimate explanations that appeal to organic evolutionary processes that are constitutive of human nature. So that's how we're going to refine, for Machery, our account of what human nature is. Of course, there's also been a lot of work problematizing the proximate ultimate distinction, so you might have worries about that appeal. But here I just want to ask, which are the organic evolutionary processes? Because that's going to turn out now to be important for Machery. What could it mean to call some evolutionary processes organic? Obviously not processes realized in organisms. That'll be trivial. All processes are realized in organisms, including social learning. Processes mediated by vertical inheritance, well, some forms of social learning will qualify there as well, and Machery wants to explicitly exclude social learning. Processes mediated in an explanatorily salient way by genetic variation, well, that seems to rule out, just by a conceptual fiat with no particular motivation, evolved traits that rely on epigenetic inheritance. And the diversity of inheritance processes is also something that John has stressed on multiple occasions. It seems to me that the disordered nature of evolutionary processes itself creates problems for Machery's appeal to which ones the organic evolutionary processes are. So just to give you some examples, Celia Hayes has made an empirical case for thinking that the capacity to imitate relies for its development, and in fact relies for its emergence over evolutionary time on learning from others. So that might sound contradictory. This is a form of learning that is itself learned, but it's not contradictory because she's talking about one type of learning being scaffolded by a different type of learning. The ability to imitate is quite hard. Not very many species are able to do it. all that well. This basically is the capacity that allows you to see the bodily emotions of another individual and then repeat those bodily emotions yourself. It's not obvious how to solve the kind of tricky coordination problems that poses, but we're very good at it. And Hayes says we learn how to do it. But it is widely shared across our species and seems to be a disposition that is very, very important for our evolution. On some views, the ability to imitate is itself one of the key engines of human technological improvement over time, for example. There also appear to be important forms of organic, non-genetic inheritance. So it's not just genes that are important inherited molecules packed into the germline, various forms of epigenetic inheritance too. There's also forms of inheritance that don't work through what's packed into the germline, but instead circumvent that. Forms of cultural inheritance, transmission of symbionts, for example. All of these things seem to be involved in producing the traits which are widely distributed among the members of our species. And there are these even more complicated hybrid forms of process as well. So what's sometimes called scaffolded development, partially cultural, partially organic. So in schematic terms, think about it like this. You might have a case where a behavior X in organisms in generation 1 makes a collective difference to the environment that's then experienced by organisms in generation 2, so that those organisms then reliably develop to acquire a trait Y, which then allows them to perform X again, and so on. So Kevin Leyland and Gillian Brown give an example here. The ways in which how individuals learn to acquire, process, and store food then makes a difference to the nutritional environment that is presented to growing organisms, which in turn makes a difference to their cognitive development, which in turn makes a difference to their own capacities to learn how to cultivate, store, and process those foods. Not straightforwardly just a matter of cultural inheritance, because it's partly about the nutritional effects that are passed on to the next generation. So you put all of these things together, and you've just got this horribly disordered set of processes that help to explain why it is that there are truths about what humans in general are like. I think this is part of the reason why it becomes hard to build not a scientific account of human nature. The sciences are capable of explaining why it is that some traits are widely shared among pretty much all members of our species. But why is that fact itself distinctively scientifically salient? That is far less clear. That's because even if there are generalizations that are true of pretty much all humans, first of all, they can be stabilized by radically different kinds of process. And those very same processes can also stabilize generalizations that only hold true at lower levels of generality within species, within our species, and perhaps also at broader levels as well. So social learning, if Hayes is right, underpins species-wide generalizations, namely social learning is what explains why it is that pretty much all humans are so good at imitation. But of course, social learning also is what underpins generalizations that don't hold good for the whole species and only hold good for particular communities if it comes to specific traditions, for example. And it also seems possible, if one looks at various aspects of emotional expression, for example, that social learning may actually explain generalizations that hold good, yes, for all humans, but at broader levels as well, for other animals that share similar emotional responsive repertoires. And of course, it's not just natural selection acting on genetic variation. That process does not solely explain why it is that there are truths that hold good for pretty much all humans. It also explains why it is that there are truths that hold good at narrower levels of magnification as well. So natural selection acting on genetic variation is also what explains, for example, the evolution of lactose tolerance within specific communities. So what you get here is a big disordered mess which means that from a scientific perspective, there's no special significance attached to those claims that hold true for most humans. It's a disordered set of processes, and it's a kind of non-salient level of magnification as well. Now, of course, none of this means that there aren't any generalisations that are robustly true of the majority of human species. But on this view, what you shouldn't do is contrast human nature in that sense with human culture, because processes of social learning can also help to explain some of the general truths. And also, as I tried to suggest, it doesn't really pick up the scientifically salient phenomenon. And I think that's why I'm here kind of reclaiming the term flip-flop. It's usually thought of as a bad thing. But here I'm saying we should flip-flop here between a kind of minimal realism about human nature and a kind of full-blooded eliminativism, precisely because it looks as though there are these generalizations that are true of the majority of humans, and yet the disordered nature of the processes that underpin them mean that you might be tempted by a kind of eliminativism. So, we were amber. I think at least some of these have gone green now. Willingness to cast doubt on specific accounts of human nature, especially alleged elements that derive from evolutionary psychology. And part of the problem there is just that I think there's a very strong case for bringing cultural evolutionary processes into the domain of human nature. I also think because of this disordered nature of processes and their hybrid form, that John's quite right to transition from a purely pro-cultural view to one that problematizes the biology-culture divide. And as I've tried to suggest, I also think this kind of awkwardness on the question of eliminativism is in some ways exactly the right view to take. We haven't gone all green yet. I mean, I do think human nature, whatever it's supposed to do as a notion, is supposed to pick out traits that are in some sense fundamental. This is something that, that John stressed in his own work, albeit sometimes only quite briefly. Hume, for example, doesn't just talk about human nature as just anything that one can say about humans. It's supposed to reflect, in some sense, the secret springs and principles by which the human mind is actuated. And you see Hume himself drawing on what you might think of anachronistically as cultural evolution when he talks about justice. Roughly speaking, his view is that humans institute conventions such as respect for private property because of the advantages they bring. Education then teaches respect for those conventions, and this leads to an altered set of underlying motivational dispositions. And Hume says that these feelings of justice take on, as he puts it, such firmness and solidity that they may fall little short of those principles, which are the most essential to our natures, the most deeply radicated in our internal constitution. So for Hume, at least, human nature doesn't just consist in all of the things that you might say about humans. Human nature consists in those things about humans which have a particular firmness and solidity, those things which have deep roots in our internal constitution, regardless of the precise processes that put them. So that's where we were. I think we've kind of also gone green, I think, on the idea that we might want to define human nature as that sort of fundamental truth. I want to talk a little bit more, though, about processes, and then I'll wrap up, and hopefully I'll get within time. So why is John suspicious of work done by human nature? Why does he think it's a generally unhelpful concept? I think there's an obvious problem with human nature, which is that the very idea of human nature is contentious. It is. What I've been calling the Humean view, just to claim that in some sense or another, assertions about human nature are just assertions about what humans in general are like, helps to explain why this notion is open to abuse. For example, you might worry that the evidence that you've collected doesn't necessarily show that the traits that we found really are typical of our species, and that they are also, in Hume's terms, deeply radicated. Have we ruled out the thought that, in fact, the traits that we've asserted to be parts of human nature might merely be typical of the subgroups we happen to have studied, or that rather than being deeply radicated, they're just products of ephemeral features of developmental environments? This is that kind of thing that people like Henrik and colleagues are up to in their kind of weird critique of psychology, where they say empirical patterns suggest we need to be less cavalier in addressing the questions of human nature on the basis of data drawn from a particularly thin and a rather unusual slice of humanity. Now, this doesn't show that you should eliminate the notion of human nature. It just shows you need to be a bit more careful in how you build your case for what you say about it. And that's why I think this problem is in some way obvious and potentially be corrected. There's a less obvious problem. What does Hume's firmness and solidity consist in the first place? What does he mean when he talks about traits being deeply radicated in our constitution? John says, correctly, I think, what humans are like is itself a matter of the constant interaction in human development between internal, narrowly biological factors and external, generally social factors. And I think this serves as a very important reminder that when traits might be hard to shift, found in pretty much all humans and hard to shift, there might be all sorts of different explanations that explain why that's the case, different processual explanations that explain why that's the case. These traits might, for some reason, be highly robust across broadly varying developmental environments. They might be hard to shift, not because they're robust across very different environments, but because a very narrow range of developmental environments are, for some reason or another, just very difficult to dislodge, very difficult to get rid of. And note that that itself could also be for very, very different underlying reasons. So it might be that we develop in certain ways, pretty much all of us, because having a gravitational field strength of the sort that's characteristic of the surface of the Earth is necessary for this, but frankly, it's very difficult to do very much about the gravitational field. But it might be that some of these features develop because environments could be easily disassembled, but there's no political will to do so. And I think this shifting away to considering how one might change external environments rather than the inevitability of a kind of internalization is an important theme in John's work as well, when he talks about particularly the dangers of the centrality of the endogenous. As John puts it, strategies of investigation that start with the influence of the environment seen as worthless. The only properly scientific way forward is investigation of the intrinsic tendency of the organisms to emit behavior of various sorts. So even the Humean notion, I think, brings risks with it, particularly if you lose track of the direction of explanation. So it's a perfectly reasonable scientific project to say, what are the factors? What are the processes that explain why it is that some features of humans are widely distributed across our species and very hard to shift? Nothing wrong with asking that question. I've tried to suggest that the nature of the processual answer given will be highly diverse, depending on precisely what we're talking about. So in that limited sense, human nature can be worthwhile as a target of explanation. But one potential answer to that question might be, the reason why this trait has been very hard to shift is just because of a lack of political will to change developmental environments. So what that means is that if our question is answered by appeal to human nature, instead of human nature being the explanandum, it becomes the explanand, then a kind of false inevitability can be imposed. The thought might be human nature itself somehow constrains us to inevitably turning out this way. And this kind of motion between human nature as explanandum and explanans, I think, generates risks. So that's where we were, and I think we've just about managed to turn those last two green here, and this helps explain why, for John, human nature is a general area. Thanks to Sabina for asking me along. Thanks to Chi-Wong, thanks to Adam too, thanks to other people as well. These were the people who I had most to do with. Thanks especially to John. You might just think, why have I left you with just a rubbish photo? I took this photo myself yesterday. It's not from a major photo agency. And I thought this sort of helpfully encapsulated some of John's themes. So here you see one of John's favorite nested processes, namely some cows. through another process, namely a tree. And the reason why it's blurred is because there's another process going on there, which is me taking the photo in a train, moving moderately quickly. There's another process. The train was actually just about to pull into the station at Crediton, which is where you live. So Crediton is also the site of one of the most important processes to have actually taught us about processes, and that process is John.